The first rule of survival is simple. Never point a weapon at someone who has already survived worse. Ash storms arrived without warning on Vera 9. One moment the desert stretched beneath pale morning light. The next, the sky became a wall of black dust and static lightning powerful enough to disable starships. Evan Brooks had lived on the frontier long enough to respect storms more than governments. The old warning siren mounted above Ashfall Relay screamed across the empty plains as he secured the final cargo container outside the station. Fine gray ash swirled around his boots while distant thunder rolled across the barren landscape. Perfect timing, Evan muttered, tightening the last restraint cable. Because obviously the universe saw me having a peaceful day and decided that was unacceptable. At 46, Evan had developed a complicated relationship with solitude. Ashfall Relay sat nearly 300 miles from the nearest settlement, little more than an aging refueling station built into the side of a rocky canyon. Most supply ships stopped only long enough to refuel before disappearing back into the stars. Evan preferred it that way. Machines rarely asked difficult questions. A sharp alarm suddenly echoed from the station's sensor array. Evan looked toward the western horizon. Through sheets of swirling ash, a bright object streaked across the dark sky, trailing smoke and fragments of glowing metal. His expression changed immediately. That was not a meteor. Mayday craft, he whispered. The object vanished behind distant rock formations less than 2 miles from the relay. Seconds later, the ground trembled softly. Evan did not hesitate. He grabbed his emergency rescue pack, sealed his environmental suit, and headed for the garage. 20 minutes later, his battered crawler vehicle climbed the final ridge overlooking the crash site. The escape pod had buried itself halfway into a field of volcanic ash near the canyon floor. Thick smoke curled upward from ruptured vents, while emergency lights flashed weakly beneath layers of dust. The pod itself was unlike anything Evan had ever seen. Elegant silver plating curved across its surface in graceful lines. Royal construction. Expensive. Very expensive. Well, Evan sighed while climbing down the slope. This just became complicated. Static electricity crackled through the air as the storm intensified overhead. The pod's external systems were failing rapidly. Evan attached a portable power cell to the emergency release panel and manually forced the hatch open. Superheated air rushed outward. Inside, illuminated by flickering red emergency lights, sat a woman. She was tall, even while seated, with luminous turquoise skin partially hidden beneath torn ceremonial clothing and damaged armor. Long silver-white hair spilled across the crash restraints. A jeweled circlet rested beside her on the deck. Unconscious, barely breathing, Evan climbed into the pod carefully. "Easy," he said softly, reaching toward the damaged restraint harness. Golden eyes snapped open instantly, faster than human reflexes should allow. Before Evan could react, a compact energy pistol appeared in her hand, aimed directly at the center of his chest. Neither moved. Outside, lightning split the dark sky. Inside the damaged pod, warning alarms continued their desperate chorus. The woman's expression remained cold, controlled, regal. "Identify yourself," she commanded. Evan looked from the weapon to the blinking fuel warning indicator mounted directly behind her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I can do that in a second." He pointed toward the flashing panel. "But unless you move about 3 feet to your left, this entire pod is about to vent reactor coolant into the cabin." The woman did not lower the weapon immediately. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Evan, sharp and unreadable, while warning alarms echoed through the damaged escape pod. Outside, ash hammered the silver hull like rain against steel. Evan stood perfectly still. He had learned long ago that frightened people often mistook movement for danger. 3 feet to the left, he repeated calmly, "or we both become part of the scenery." For a moment, he thought she would ignore him. Then her gaze flickered toward the warning panel behind her shoulder. The display had shifted from amber to flashing crimson. She moved instantly, fast enough that Evan barely tracked it. 1 second she sat restrained in the crash seat. The next, she stood beside the opposite bulkhead, weapon still raised. Evan quietly stepped past her and opened an emergency maintenance panel beneath the pilot console. "You are remarkably calm," she observed. Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to obedience. "Occupational habit," Evan replied. He disconnected 2 damaged conduits and manually shut down the coolant feed. The warning alarm immediately changed pitch before falling silent. The woman watched every movement. What occupation? Rescue and recovery. Evan sealed the panel and finally looked at her. Mostly people. Occasionally stubborn machinery. She did not smile. Identify yourself. Evan Brooks. Owner, mechanic, cook, and currently acting emergency response team for Ashfall Relay. He nodded toward the still-raised pistol. Your turn. The woman hesitated. Malira. Evan noticed she offered only one name. Important people often did that. Before he could ask anything else, a secondary explosion somewhere deep inside the pod shook the entire structure. Dust rained from the ceiling. Evan immediately grabbed a thermal blanket and held it over Malira as a damaged overhead panel collapsed beside them. She stared at him in visible surprise. We need to leave, Evan said. Now. Malira lowered the weapon slightly, but did not holster it. Together, they climbed from the damaged pod into the storm. The wind had intensified. Visibility had fallen below 30 feet. Evan handed her a spare breathing mask. Stay close. I do not require protection. Evan looked toward the black sky where lightning crawled through clouds of ash. The storm disagrees. They began the long walk back toward Ashfall Relay. Malira stumbled only once before regaining perfect balance. Even exhausted, she moved with extraordinary grace. Evan noticed other things too. The way she constantly scanned the horizon. The way she positioned herself to watch both him and the surrounding terrain simultaneously. Soldier, he thought immediately. Very well trained. Halfway back to the station, they discovered another escape pod partially buried beneath ash. Smaller. Civilian model. Evan rushed toward it without hesitation. Inside, a frightened diplomatic aide and a young child sat huddled together beneath emergency blankets. Both were alive. Malira became completely still. Impossible, she whispered. Evan had already begun helping the survivors from the pod. Can they walk? The aide nodded weakly. Malira looked from the survivors to Evan. You do not even know who they are. Evan adjusted the child's thermal hood. Neither did I know who you were. He looked toward the distant lights of Ashfall Relay glowing through the storm. Come on. Everybody is getting inside before this weather kills us. For the first time since awakening inside the wreckage, Queen Malira Voss lowered her weapon completely. Ashfall Relay looked even smaller with extra survivors. The old station had been designed to support 6 people comfortably. It now housed 11. Evan considered this optimistic engineering. The airlock cycled open with a tired hiss as the group stumbled inside, carrying layers of ash and exhaustion with them. Warm recycled air flooded the chamber. The young diplomatic child immediately burst into tears. The sound seemed to surprise everyone, including the child. Evan knelt beside her without hesitation. That is normal, he said softly, handing her a steaming cup of synthetic cocoa from the emergency dispenser. Storms make everybody cry eventually. Usually me around tax season. The child laughed weakly through her tears. Malira watched the exchange in silence. Inside the station, emergency lanterns cast soft amber light across aging machinery, stacked supply crates, and walls covered with decades of repair notes. Ashfall Relay was not impressive. It was simply lived in. Evan guided the survivors toward the common room. Blankets are in the storage locker. Medical supplies are on the left shelf. Coffee is terrible, but plentiful. The diplomatic aide stared around nervously. You live here alone? Mostly. Evan removed his weather coat and began checking the station systems. The generators complain less than people do. Malira remained standing near the entrance, studying everything. Even now, after surviving a crash and a storm, she still positioned herself where she could observe every exit. Her damaged ceremonial clothing had been replaced with a thermal blanket draped across her shoulders, yet she still carried herself like royalty. You should rest, Evan said while adjusting the air filters. Your injuries need time. Malira folded her arms. I do not rest while security conditions remain uncertain. Evan nodded toward the window where ash continued sweeping across the canyon outside. Trust me, nobody is visiting tonight. As though the universe had taken this personally, the external sensor alarm immediately sounded. Evan closed his eyes. I really need to stop saying things like that. He moved to the communications console. A long-range scan had detected multiple vessels entering the upper atmosphere. Large vessels. Military vessels. Malira crossed the room instantly. One look at the sensor signatures drained what little color remained from her luminous skin. No, she whispered. Evan looked at her. Friends. No. Family. Malira remained silent. That answer told him enough. The diplomatic aide stepped closer to the display and visibly paled. Your Majesty, he whispered before quickly lowering his head. The room became perfectly still. Evan slowly looked from the aide to Malira. Your Majesty? The child looked confused. She is the queen, she announced matter-of-factly. Everybody knows that. Evan stared at Malira for several seconds. She met his gaze steadily, waiting for something. Fear perhaps. Anger. Accusation. Instead, Evan simply nodded once. Well, he said, returning to the console. That explains the jewelry. Malira blinked. You are not surprised? Evan checked the incoming flight paths. Ma'am, I once rescued a smuggler, 2 senators, and an opera singer from the same cargo wreck. After that, royalty stopped feeling unusual. Outside, lightning flashed across the dark sky. The approaching ships continued descending. Malira looked toward the frightened civilians sheltering inside the station. Then toward Evan. Those ships are not here to rescue me, she said quietly. They are here to remove me. Evan studied the tactical display for a long moment. Old instincts stirred quietly beneath years of peaceful isolation. All right, he said softly. Then we should probably start preparing. Queen Malira Voss expected panic. Royal security doctrine taught that civilians usually panicked when succession crises arrived at their doorstep. Ashfall Relay proved the doctrine incomplete. Evan Brooks simply walked to a storage cabinet and removed 3 old data pads, a toolbox, and what appeared to be a handwritten maintenance notebook held together with tape. What are you doing? Malira asked. Evan placed the items on the central table. Inventory. The station may soon be surrounded by hostile forces. Exactly. He opened the notebook. Which means I need to know how many emergency oxygen masks still function. Malira stared at him. You are preparing for a siege by counting masks? Evan looked genuinely confused. Well, yes. Breathing tends to improve morale. The young diplomatic aide unexpectedly laughed. The sound broke some of the tension inside the room. Outside, the first military shuttle descended through the storm clouds and settled nearly half a mile from the relay. Then another, and another. Sensor displays tracked at least 30 individuals establishing a perimeter around the canyon. Malira recognized the formation immediately. Imperial internal security. Not rescue personnel. Not loyalists. Specialists. Her expression hardened. They will attempt to isolate the station and force surrender. Evan nodded while distributing thermal blankets among the survivors. Good thing this place was designed by paranoid engineers. He activated a holographic map of Ashfall Relay. Hidden maintenance tunnels illuminated beneath the station. Secondary air recyclers. Emergency shelters carved into bedrock decades earlier. Malira looked surprised. There are underground sections? Nobody reads maintenance manuals, Evan said. Their loss. He assigned the diplomatic aide responsibility for the children, instructed another survivor to monitor communications, then calmly checked every pressure seal throughout the station. Watching him work unsettled Malira. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Every action seemed automatic, practiced long ago and never forgotten. You have done this before, she said quietly as he reinforced an interior bulkhead. Evan tightened the final bolt. Something similar. Military. He was silent for several seconds. A long time ago. Before Malira could continue, the communications console activated. A calm voice filled the station. Attention occupants of Ashfall Relay. This facility is now under Imperial authority. Queen Malira Voss is ordered to surrender herself immediately. The survivors exchanged frightened glances. The child moved closer to Malira instinctively. The queen looked down at her small hand gripping the edge of her borrowed blanket. I should go, Malira said softly. This is not your fight. Evan continued sealing supply containers. No, you do not understand. They will not leave while I remain here. Probably true. He finally looked at her. But you are under my roof. Malira frowned. I am a sovereign ruler, and currently a guest with untreated injuries. Evan crossed the room and handed her a steaming cup of coffee. Same rules apply. She accepted it automatically. You cannot protect me from internal security. Evan took a slow sip from his own cup. Ma'am, I am not protecting you. Malira looked confused. Evan nodded toward the frightened civilians sheltering nearby. I am protecting them. Outside, powerful floodlights suddenly illuminated the canyon walls surrounding Ashfall Relay. The station seemed very small beneath such overwhelming force. Yet inside, beneath warm amber lights and the smell of terrible coffee, nobody felt alone. For reasons she could not explain, Queen Malira Voss lowered her eyes and held the cup a little tighter. The siege entered its 6th hour just after midnight. Outside Ashfall Relay, floodlights cast long shadows across the canyon while freezing winds carried streams of gray ash through the darkness. Inside, the station remained warm, crowded, and surprisingly calm. Evan considered that a victory. Most crises became manageable once people had hot drinks and useful tasks. Queen Malira stood alone near the observation window, watching distant figures move between the imperial encampments below. Their formations remained disciplined. Patient. They were waiting. You should sleep, Evan said, placing another cup of coffee beside her. Malira did not look away from the window. Queens do not sleep during coups. Evan leaned against the console. That sounds exhausting. It is. Silence settled between them. The station hummed softly around them. Somewhere down the corridor, the diplomatic child laughed at one of the aide's stories. The sound seemed strangely precious inside a besieged outpost. Malira finally spoke. You are still not afraid. Evan took a sip from his coffee. I did not say that. She turned toward him. You show no signs of fear. Evan looked out toward the floodlit canyon. Fear and panic are not the same thing. He smiled faintly. I have been scared before. This is not it. Malira studied him carefully. What frightened you? The question lingered between them. Evan remained silent for several seconds. Atlas Rift, he said quietly. Long time ago. Malira frowned. The humanitarian collapse? Evan nodded. Rescue operations. Nothing more. Yet something in his expression changed. The warmth vanished briefly from his eyes. Malira noticed immediately. You served there. Yes. Very few survived Atlas Rift. Evan looked down at his coffee cup. Enough did. Before Malira could ask another question, warning alarms echoed through the station. One of the external pressure sensors had failed. The old relay shuddered softly as high winds struck the canyon wall. Evan was already moving. Stay with the others, he called while grabbing a repair harness. The western seal needs reinforcing. Malira followed him anyway. They climbed narrow maintenance ladders into the upper service corridors where ancient pipes and power conduits lined the walls. Freezing air whistled through a fractured pressure seal near the western bulkhead. Beyond the crack, the storm raged across the canyon. Evan immediately secured himself to a safety line and began repairs. Malira watched him work. Efficient. Methodical. No wasted movement. Then another alarm sounded. Different this time. Motion sensors. Someone had entered the outer maintenance tunnels beneath the station. Evan froze for half a second. Nothing more. How many underground entrances exist? Malira asked. 7. How many do they know about? Evan secured the final seal. Hopefully 3. Malira stared. You intentionally concealed access routes. Evan shrugged. Paranoid engineers. Remember? They hurried back toward the operations room. Halfway there, the station lights suddenly failed. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Several frightened voices echoed from below. Malira instinctively reached for her weapon. Evan did not. He simply stopped moving and listened. Complete silence. Then he quietly smiled. Backup generator just activated. Emergency lights flickered on moments later. The survivors remained safe. Malira looked at him in disbelief. How did you know? Evan adjusted the flashlight on his tool belt. The station sounded wrong for about 3 seconds. Malira stopped walking. You recognized a power failure by sound alone? Evan looked genuinely puzzled. You live somewhere long enough, you learn its voice. For reasons she could not explain, Queen Malira suddenly understood that the calm mechanic standing beside her was not simply a frontier rescuer. He was a soldier. And soldiers who survived Atlas Rift were not ordinary men. Morning never truly arrived at Ashfall Relay. The storm clouds remained overhead, turning sunrise into little more than a faint silver glow beyond layers of ash. Inside the station, people had settled into an uneasy routine. Children slept beneath thermal blankets in the storage room. The diplomatic staff organized supplies. Evan repaired machinery. Life, he believed, should continue whenever possible. It reminded Fear that it had not won. Queen Malira found him in the maintenance bay replacing a damaged coolant pump. "You should be resting," she said. Evan tightened a valve without looking up. "I could say the same thing. Queens are not permitted such luxuries." Evan smiled faintly. "That sounds like terrible management." For the first time in hours, Malira almost smiled back. She had spent her entire life surrounded by advisors, generals, and politicians. None had ever spoken to her this way. Outside, the siege continued. Inside, an old mechanic argued with malfunctioning equipment and occasionally with coffee machines. It felt strangely peaceful. Then the communications console activated. "Attention occupants," an unfamiliar voice announced. "This situation is no longer necessary. Surrender the Queen, and all civilians will be permitted safe passage." The survivors grew silent. Malira lowered her eyes. "They are changing tactics." Evan nodded, offering choices people should not have to make. The diplomatic aide approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider." Malira raised her hand gently. "No." She looked toward the frightened child sleeping nearby. "I will not purchase my safety with theirs." Evan quietly set down his wrench. "Good," he said, "because nobody here voted for that plan anyway." Malira stared at him. "You would risk your life for a ruler you met yesterday?" Evan thought about it. "No." He wiped grease from his hands. "I would risk my life for people sheltering in my station." He paused. "You just happen to be one of them." Before Malira could answer, every alarm and ashfall relay suddenly activated simultaneously. Red emergency lights flooded the corridors. Motion sensors. Pressure warnings. External breach alerts. Evan moved instantly. Not quickly. Efficiently. Purposefully. "Everyone to shelter 2, he ordered calmly. The survivors obeyed without hesitation. Malira noticed that. Nobody questioned him. Nobody panicked. They simply moved. "How do you remain this calm?" she asked while helping guide the child towards safety. Evan checked several sensor feeds simultaneously. "Because panic is contagious." He looked at her. "So is calm." The tactical display illuminated. Multiple unauthorized entries had been detected inside the abandoned maintenance tunnels beneath the station. Malira recognized the pattern immediately. Internal security had abandoned negotiation. "They are trying to corner us," she whispered. Evan studied the map quietly. Then he reached beneath the operations console and removed an old metal case covered in dust. Malira watched as he opened it. Inside rested faded military insignia, an ancient rescue beacon, and a worn service datapad. The screen activated automatically. Service record, Staff Sergeant Evan Brooks. Atlas Rift Evacuation Corps. Commendation status, sealed. Malira looked up slowly. Evan closed the case. "I retired a long time ago," he said softly. "But some habits stay with you." He looked toward the frightened civilians disappearing into the shelter corridor. Then toward the tactical display showing hostile forces converging from every direction. Finally, he exhaled quietly. "Looks like somebody forgot an important rule." Malira frowned. "What rule?" Evan met her eyes. For the first time since meeting him, she saw the soldier beneath the mechanic. Never corner people whose first instinct is to protect others. The underground maintenance tunnels beneath Ashfall Relay had not been used in nearly 15 years. Dust coated every surface. Ancient conduit pipes lined the narrow corridors. Emergency lights flickered weakly overhead, casting long shadows across rusted access panels and forgotten equipment. Evan moved through the maze with absolute certainty. Malira followed close behind, carrying medical supplies while the surviving civilians hurried toward Shelter 2. "How many times have you walked these tunnels?" she asked quietly. "Enough," Evan replied. "The station and I have an understanding." He stopped at an intersection and sealed 2 bulkhead doors manually. "It complains. I fix things. We coexist peacefully." Malira watched him reroute power through a maintenance console older than some civilizations. His hands moved automatically, almost without thought. "You prepared this station long before today." Evan nodded. "Frontier rule. Hope for visitors. Prepare for disasters." Warning tones echoed softly through the tunnel network. Internal security teams had entered the outer maintenance sections. Their progress appeared methodical. Predictable. Evan studied an old schematic displayed on his datapad. "They are herding us toward the central corridor." Malira looked surprised. "How can you know that?" Evan pointed toward the map. Because it is what I would do. The answer unsettled her. Deep beneath the station, the civilians gathered inside Shelter 2. The frightened child immediately ran toward Evan when he entered. Are we safe? She whispered. Evan crouched beside her. For now. What happens next? The former soldier smiled gently. Next, everybody eats breakfast. Several adults stared at him in disbelief. Breakfast? The diplomatic aide repeated. There are hostile forces inside the station. Evan handed him a crate of ration packs. People think better on full stomachs. Malira realized something important then. Evan was not keeping people alive. He was keeping them human. A sudden voice echoed across the station intercom. Staff Sergeant Evan Brooks. The transmission announced calmly. We know who you are. Silence filled the shelter. Malira slowly looked toward him. Evan did not react. He simply continued distributing food. The voice continued. Atlas Rift. Evacuation Corps. 314 civilians extracted under impossible conditions. Commendation sealed by Earth Defense Command. The adults exchanged stunned glances. Even Malira felt her breath catch. Atlas Rift had become legend throughout explored space. You have already sacrificed enough, Sergeant, the voice said. Surrender the Queen. Protect your people. For the first time, Evan stopped moving. The shelter became perfectly still. After several long seconds, he walked to the intercom panel and activated it. You made one mistake, he said quietly. What mistake? The voice asked. Evan looked around the shelter. The frightened child. The exhausted aide. The Queen who had arrived holding a weapon and now sat sharing blankets with civilians. These are my people now. He deactivated the transmission. No dramatic speech. No anger. Just certainty. Malira stared at him. You truly mean that? Evan looked mildly confused. Of course. The station suddenly went dark. Complete darkness swallowed the shelter. Several civilians gasped. Then emergency lights illuminated a new route on the walls. Evan smiled faintly. Good. Good. Malira asked. They finally committed. He handed her a flashlight and opened a hidden maintenance hatch concealed behind an old storage rack. A narrow escape corridor stretched into darkness beyond. Malira, he said softly. They think they cornered a soldier. He looked back toward the station above them. What they actually cornered was a rescue worker. And rescue workers do not leave people behind. The hidden escape corridor descended deep beneath Ashfall Relay, winding through abandoned geothermal shafts carved during the station's earliest construction. Emergency lights glowed faint blue along the walls, illuminating decades of dust and forgotten equipment. Evan led the group without hesitation. Children walked in the center. Adults carried supplies. Queen Malira remained near the rear, instinctively guarding those behind her. The arrangement felt natural now. How much farther? The diplomatic aide asked quietly. Evan checked an old wall marker. About 600 feet. To where? Secondary evacuation hangar. Malira looked surprised. There is a hangar beneath this station? Evan nodded. Technically, it is an oversized maintenance garage with ambitious dreams. A distant vibration echoed through the tunnel network. Internal security teams had entered the lower corridors above them. They were searching systematically. Efficiently. Malira recognized the pattern immediately. They are adapting. Evan smiled faintly. Good professionals usually do. They continued downward until the tunnel opened into an enormous underground chamber. Ancient service vehicles rested beneath layers of dust. At the center sat an aging atmospheric transport shuttle. Scarred. Weathered. Functional. Mostly. The frightened child stared upward in amazement. You have a spaceship? Evan looked almost embarrassed. I have a project. Malira slowly walked around the vessel. Military modifications had been added discreetly over many years. Reinforced life support. Expanded rescue capacity. Emergency medical systems. This is not civilian equipment, she said quietly. Evan opened an access panel. Atlas Rift changed a lot of people. Before she could ask more, the station intercom crackled unexpectedly. Somehow internal security had restored partial communications. A familiar voice echoed throughout the chamber. Staff Sergeant Brooks. You know there is no escape. Evan continued preparing the shuttle. Probably. Then why continue? Silence lingered for several seconds. Evan finally answered. Because there are children listening. Malira looked toward him. The voice continued. You cannot save everyone. Evan paused. For the first time since Malira had met him, Genuine sadness crossed his face. I know, he said softly. I learned that at Atlas Rift. The transmission ended. No one spoke for several moments. Malira approached him quietly. 314 civilians, she said. That was your evacuation record. Evan nodded once. 315, he corrected gently. One little girl did not make it onto the final shuttle. The chamber fell silent. Malira suddenly understood. Atlas Rift had not created the man standing before her. It had broken him. And somehow, instead of becoming bitter, he had chosen kindness. Warning alarms interrupted the moment. Internal security units had reached the upper maintenance access points. They would arrive soon. Evan immediately resumed preparations. Everyone aboard. The civilians obeyed instantly. Malira remained beside him. And you? Evan secured the final fuel connection. Somebody needs to activate the launch tunnel manually. That can be done remotely. Not on a station built 100 years ago. Malira understood immediately. He intended to stay behind. No, she said firmly. Evan looked at her calmly. Malira, no. She stepped closer. You once told me that people under your roof become your responsibility. Her golden eyes met his. You are under mine now. Evan almost smiled. Distant footsteps echoed through the upper corridors. Time had run out. Malira slowly removed her sidearm and placed it in his hand. I pointed this at you when we met, she said softly. I was wrong. Evan looked down at the weapon, then back at her. The queen lowered her head slightly, a gesture no ruler had ever witnessed from her before. Thank you, she whispered, for reminding me what soldiers are meant to protect. The launch sequence began with a sound older than the station itself. Deep beneath Ashfall Relay, dormant engines awakened one by one, filling the underground chamber with a low mechanical rumble that vibrated through stone and steel. Civilians hurried aboard the transport while warning alarms echoed from the upper tunnels. Internal security teams were close now. Very close. Evan finished connecting the final power conduit and sealed the maintenance panel. All passengers aboard. The diplomatic aide called from the shuttle entrance. The frightened child suddenly ran back across the loading ramp and wrapped her arms around Evan's waist. You are coming too, she said with absolute certainty. Evan knelt beside her. That is the plan. The child studied him carefully, apparently deciding whether to believe him. Satisfied, she returned to the shuttle. Children, Evan reflected, remained humanity's greatest lie detectors. Queen Malira stood beside the boarding ramp, silver hair illuminated by emergency lights. The launch tunnel cannot be opened from inside the shuttle, she said quietly. No, Evan admitted. It cannot. Then you were going to remain behind. Evan looked toward the approaching motion indicators displayed on the wall console. Occupational habit. Malira shook her head softly. No, survivor's habit. Before Evan could answer, a new voice echoed through the chamber speakers. Calm. Authoritative. Staff Sergeant Brooks. This situation has ended. Release the Queen and evacuate your civilians. Evan activated the external communicator. Negative. Silence followed. Then the voice returned. Why? Evan looked around the old hangar. The patch walls. The ancient shuttle. The people waiting aboard. Finally, he smiled faintly. Because somebody has to teach future generations that protecting people still matters. He deactivated the channel. Malira stared at him for several seconds. Then she turned toward the communicator and activated a secure Imperial frequency. Her voice changed instantly. Strong. Regal. Unmistakably royal. This is Queen Malira Voss. Effective immediately, all internal security forces are ordered to stand down. The chamber fell silent. Your Majesty, the commander replied cautiously. The council authorized. I am the council, Malira interrupted. And I have witnessed enough. She looked toward Evan. Any government that demands innocent lives to preserve power has already failed. Several long seconds passed. Then, one by one, the hostile sensor contacts outside the station began withdrawing. Across the tactical display, red indicators slowly disappeared. The siege was over. No battles. No final confrontation. Just a queen making a choice. An hour later, the storm had finally passed. Ashfall Relay stood battered but intact beneath a sky filled with stars. Rescue ships descended peacefully into the canyon while civilians emerged from shelter laughing with exhausted relief. Evan sat alone on the station roof repairing a damaged weather sensor when Malira joined him. Neither spoke immediately. The desert stretched endlessly before them, quiet at last. When I first saw you, Malira said softly, I pointed a weapon at you because I believed cornered soldiers were dangerous. Evan adjusted the sensor array. Reasonable assumption. Malira smiled faintly. Now I understand the truth. She looked toward the lights of the station below where children played beside exhausted diplomats and mechanics shared coffee. Cornered soldiers are dangerous only when they stop remembering what they protect. Evan looked toward the stars. Fortunately, most never forget. They sat together in silence while dawn slowly painted the horizon gold. Somewhere beyond that endless sky, empires would continue arguing about power. But on a forgotten frontier world, a queen had lowered her weapon, a soldier had kept his promise, and an old relay station had reminded them both that mercy was sometimes the strongest shield in the galaxy.